The opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of our sponsors and are only those of the individual commentators. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good evening and welcome to the Raben Report. I'm your host, Elliot Raben, and with me, as always, is my expert panel, Christina and Anna. Christina, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am good. Anna, how are you?
I am good, Elliot.
That is good to hear. I'm glad everybody's good. And of course, joining the panel this week is our guest, Tonya Wiseman. Tonya, how are you? Thank you for being here.
No worries. Thank you for having me back over. I'm good. Thank you.
Of course. Just to remind our viewers, you want to tell everyone a little about yourself?
Sure. So I'm a recent political science graduate from Ryerson. And last time I was on the show, during my intro, I mentioned that I wanted to do a poli-sci master's, but I think I kind of changed my mind about that. And instead, I'm going to do the law school route and take my LSAT later this year. Just for practical reasons, I think it's a better route to go. So we'll see. Yeah.
Wow. So you've got a lot of work
Yeah.
coming your way.
Yeah.
But thank you again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you succeed in everything you do.
Thank you.
So coming up in 15 minutes, we'll be talking about our main topic, which is assisted dying. But first, let's take a look at our weekly updates, starting with coronavirus update. So a lot going on. The Auditor General reported that the Trudeau government mishandled the pandemic. Karen Hogan, who's the Auditor General of the Public Health Agency of Canada, said that the Departments of Public Health and Canada Border Services that are in charge of billions of support programs provide a sweeping narrative of the Liberal government's reaction from the day a strange new virus was observed in China and over the surreal months that would follow. On the public health side, Hogan detailed one gap after another that added up to an abyss. Canada didn't see the pandemic coming, underestimated it initially, and as of late November still lacked the data to fully track or grasp its actual spread. So what do you guys think of the government's handling of the pandemic? At first they said that it wasn't a big deal, and I have to remind our viewers, Season 8 premiere, I called it. I said that it was going to be a big deal. Nobody believed me. But what do you guys think, Christina?
I feel like I've expressed it on the show before in the other coronavirus episodes and updates.
Yeah.
And I never thought that they handled it well. I thought maybe at the beginning I was kind of hopeful that they were doing the right thing. I've said before that I think that the initial lockdown was a good idea and that we were kind of getting things under control, and then somehow it all spiraled. Well, not somehow. It was mishandled. We didn't lock the country up enough, and we didn't do it quick enough. And now there's other countries that are living like there's nothing wrong,
Like New Zealand, for example.
And my mom made a good point, though, because I brought this up to her, and I said that I was so upset. People in Australia, New Zealand, they're living their best lives like nothing's happening. But she did make the point that islands are much easier to isolate, and it's a lot easier to contain things. So that's why it's probably a bit easier over there. But yeah, I don't think that they handled it well, and I think that a lot of this could have been avoided if we had taken measures sooner, and if we were smarter about what measures we were putting in place.
Anna?
Well, I also agree with Christina in the sense that they didn't lock the country early enough. And also, it's ridiculous because on one side you have these governments saying, you need to stay at home. You cannot open this kind of business. Let's keep certain industries stopping from operating them. And then you see rallies. And then you see people protesting in the street for any reason. And, I don't think that the coronavirus is like, oh, this is a very noble cause. I'm not going to contaminate these people. Like, that's not how it works. Then we're going to be under another lockdown. Woohoo!
And Ford has said that he's prepared to lock everybody down again amid a third wave. Tonya?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I agree with both Christina and Anna. I think that obviously a stricter border control towards the beginning of this pandemic would have helped a lot, as well as a mask mandate, I think, would have helped. But I don't think Trudeau really has the leadership skills or willingness, or did have the willingness or leadership to want to do that. So I think that's a problem. Yeah.
Well, opponents would say that he came out and he was doing daily press conferences, and they would consider that as transparency and keeping people updated about the situation. Would you agree, Tonya?
Not necessarily. Again, because sorry, you need to stay. Okay, I think Trudeau. He has a very powerful position, and he really could have, especially international flights, he could have just locked down the country a lot more heavily than he did in the beginning. And again, like Anna said, New Zealand did that. They also did the mask mandate, and they're not living without it. So, as well as Australia, I think they don't have any lockdown measures either. So
yeah. Israel was a very strict country in terms of their lockdowns and all, and now they have, I believe, over 50-60% of the population vaccinated. They're starting to have concerts for people that were vaccinated.
Wow.
Yep, there was a test.
I don't even remember what it's like to go to a concert. Like, it's so upsetting. I miss live music. I miss clubbing. I miss doing, like, things in public that were unsanitary, like going to a club.
I'm sorry, expand on that.
I mean, like going to a club.
No,
clubs. What I mean is that like clubs, bars are very dirty places, right?
Oh,
At least maybe they're not anymore, but they
won't be in the future.
Right. They're grungy. There's like shit all over the floors, and it's a mess, but it's so much fun. That's what I mean. That's what I miss.
Okay.
I miss
just had to clarify, because when you said doing unsanitary things in public,
I realized after it came out of my mouth that it didn't sound the way that I wanted it to. But yes.
Dos Latinas, everybody. Well, let's move on, because coronavirus is just weighing down on everybody. But of course, we had to talk about it. Let's talk about Kylie Jenner and GoFundMe. What's going on, you might ask? Well, Kylie Jenner's former makeup artist Samuel Rauda got into a car accident and requires emergency surgery totaling $60,000 US. She shared the GoFundMe set up by his family on her story and donated $5,000. But people were quick to call her out for not donating more. Jenner took to Instagram to defend herself, clarifying that Rauda isn't her makeup artist, and unfortunately, they don't have a personal relationship anymore. Should she have donated more, or was it sufficient? Is she fair to ask for donations and having only donated $5,000, considering that she's worth $1 billion?
I mean, considering she buys her toddler designer handbags for probably more than $60,000.
$15,000.
Yeah, okay. So it just speaks to the amount of money she has. That the disposable income is through the roof for her and that entire family. And I understand that maybe now at this point in her life, there's not really a personal relationship between her and this makeup artist, and $5,000 is a huge donation. It's great, but for someone worth $1 billion, but for someone who has as much money as she does, and people had already been making donations. She didn't necessarily have to pay all. People had already made donations. She could have done whatever the balance was, whatever was remaining of what he needed, just top it off, because you have that money and you spend that money on toddlers' handbags and designer clothes and designer shoes.
Well, Anna, you had go ahead.
And I mean, then I also run into the problems like people should be able to do what they want with their money, and it is her money, and I would hate for someone to tell me that I didn't have enough money, that I hadn't donated enough money, or that I could have done more. Obviously, I'm in a much different position. I am, I don't have Kylie Jenner, like, I can't even make a comparison in terms of the money that she has. It's uncomparable. I am so poor next to Kylie Jenner.
We
So
all are.
I can't even envision having that much money. But I'd like to think if I was in that position, maybe I would have donated more. But
Well,
I don't know.
Anna?
The way that I see it is that a lot of people are they're ready to judge rich people particularly. And people get, for example, they were saying like, eat the rich. And it's like, she already did something with sharing and using her influence to spread the information about the GoFundMe. Like, that's something that is important. I wish we could contact Kylie Jenner to create a GoFundMe for the Raben Report. So, exactly. And to be honest, it is like she already donated herself. People are very ready to judge rich people. I think that is led by resentfulness, to be honest, and envy. And because she is already using her influence in a positive way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of the Kardashians of any of these people, but it's her money and she already donated and she's doing what she can. Well, she can do more, but it's about willingness. She's doing already something, and you should not pressure people that because they have this money they have the obligation to do more, because it's not really an obligation.
And you did say that before the show started. We were talking about it. You said that people can do what they want with their money, and if you were to donate to every single cause that you believe in, you're going to run out of money.
Please, Kylie Jenner, go and fund overthrowing Maduro in Venezuela. I would literally love that.
And if you're going to be funding Raben Report, also wouldn't mind. Then again, final season, so you missed your chance. You would have had some prime advertising space right here.
Yes,
just
please.
telling you that. But anyway, let's move on finally to not The Devil Wears Prada, but in reality, The Devil Wears Lil Nas X. Lil Nas X teamed up with Brooklyn-based streetwear company MSCHF on the limited Satan Shoe, unofficial name, release. The Old Town Road singer collaborated with them to sell the unofficial Satan shoes, and it will feature a bronze pentagram, an inverted cross, and a drop of real human blood. They are a limited edition with only 666 pairs in total, and they're priced at $1,018, a reference to the Bible passage Luke 10:18 that reads, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." A spokesperson said that members of the art collective had provided the blood, adding, "We love to sacrifice for our art." The group also confirmed to CNN that Nike was not involved in this in any capacity. However, as of yesterday, Nike has filed a trademark infringement lawsuit against the designer of Lil Nas X's Satan shoes because clearly it was hurting their public image. So, guys, what do you think about the shoes, number one? And number two, Nike filing the lawsuit? Because Nike has been supporting different causes in the past, Colin Kaepernick, and very progressive to a degree causes, right? But would you consider this a progressive cause?
No.
People can.
This one is like going way too extreme, and it's like the things that I cannot imagine a business partner in Nike being offered, like, look at this proposition, and then being like, it seems like a great idea to do these kind of shoes with human blood. It seems amazing. Like, Nike is a big corporation. I think they are controversial for sure, but they manage their risk appetite regarding this, And regarding the shoes, well, if that's the shoes of Satan, I think that he lowered his standards from Prada to this, honestly.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Tanya? What do you think of the Satan shoes?
First of all, they're ugly shoes, but secondly, there's a broader issue here, and it's Satanism in entertainment and being just shown in the media by celebrities in music industry. And obviously, rightfully so, Nike taking action is expected, I think. And yeah, I think it's disgusting.
Christina?
I don't really care, to be totally honest with you.
Didn't expect that.
I've never really cared about the whole Satanism thing in media. It's like, to me, and this could be because I'm non-religious and I maybe don't understand how it how it affects people who are religious. For me, I found this whole thing kind of comedic, and I know that like there's people who are very, very distraught over this, and I feel badly for them. But for me, I just don't care. I think it's all just a joke, and I mean, if you want publicity, this is exactly how you do it.
Exactly. It is like, wow, surprising. An artist making like media by making fun of Christians. Wow, something that has done even in the 70s. Like, how edgy is that really?
I'm not religious either, but I just see a problem with people with an influential image promoting Satanism when it means something so vicious, even if it's fictitious. I don't know.
Yeah, I understand that. Like, for me, I've never cared for it. I don't, the same way that I'm not really affected by
Cardi B.
Yeah, I just don't really care. He's an artist. He's allowed to push these boundaries, and it makes people uncomfortable. And that's, to be fair, artists are allowed to do that. If it makes you uncomfortable, they're doing something, like this is, and it's nobody's business but his own. And the people who want to purchase and engage with his image and his product, whatever. Do I think the real human blood in the shoes is gross and probably a sanitary issue? Yes. But
says the one who's prepared to do unsanitary things in the street.
Well, I'm not going to be consuming other people's blood. You know what I mean? Like, it's,
you wouldn't consume it. It would be in the
right,
shoe.
It's just in the shoe,
you
but it's still like, to me, it's kind of gross. But
unless
I also,
you leak the shoe, just imagine that.
I mean, there's people who, like, even Megan Fox and her partner, Machine Gun Kelly, have necklaces with a drop of each other's blood.
No, that's fine. That's consensual between two loving partners.
Right, but if you're buying shoes, you're consenting to buying the blood.
It's the message. It's all. That's all.
And the people who donated the blood consented to the blood being donated. But,
that's true.
But you know what? Let's move on. Usually we have 3 things in our weekly update, but the girls don't know that I added this. Happy birthday, Celine Dion!
I felt like that was coming.
It is Celine Dion's birthday today, and I think I'd be mad at myself if I didn't mention it. So she turns 53 today, and she is incredible as ever. She's an icon. She is a role model for me personally, and I wish her nothing but the best. So that was just had to mention that. But now let's move on to our main topic, which is on March 11th, the House of Commons passed Bill C-7, expanding assisted dying to include mental illness. On March 26th, it was passed by the Senate and made royal assent. Thanks to the Bloc Québécois, the Liberals were able to pass this motion. The changes proposed and now approved were to expand assisted dying to intolerably suffering individuals who are not approaching the natural end of their lives. Previously, only those with a foreseeable end of life were eligible. The other change, the more controversial of the two, would also allow people suffering solely from mental illness to request assisted death. Now, while this particular provision won't come into effect for 2 years, the questions arise right now. The government has committed to setting up a special task force to advise on how to protect those most vulnerable, but disability rights groups have many concerns. Notably, they fear such vulnerable people will be pressured, either directly or indirectly, through societal attitudes and lack of support services, to end their lives prematurely. All these questions and concerns must be taken into account, and tonight, with our guest Tonya, our panel cross-examines this new bill and the impact it will have on those truly suffering. From the ethical, moral, and societal standpoints, should this bill have been passed? It's time to find out. This is a sensitive issue, so we'd like to remind our viewers that viewer discretion is advised. And as always, we are live on Facebook, so make sure to comment on our feed to have your thoughts read live on air. So let's begin. Do you guys support assisted dying as a whole, Christina?
Yes, I do.
You do, Anna?
I don't support for mentally ill people, but I support
it as a whole.
On other circumstances, yeah.
And Tonya, do you support assisted dying?
Yes, for both mental and physical, mostly speaking, yes.
Okay, so before we get to the mentally ill portion, for those that are mentally ill, is assisted dying moral? Because a doctor is being told to take someone else's life. So is it moral?
I think it depends on what your morals are. I think everybody views it differently. Like for me, I think that you should have the right to go out on your own terms. And, if you're basically awaiting a terrible death, then I think morally, like you should not keep someone alive under those circumstances. So I think it depends on the individual. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would say that it's not moral, that it's wrong, that it's murder, whatever they might say. But I think that if death is imminent and it's going to happen, then why not let the person go peacefully rather than having to suffer until their death?
Anna?
I think that no doctor should feel the pressure to conduct these kind of things. Like when it comes to medicines, you are supposed to save people's lives. So for not every doctor has that capability of going and giving that solution to the patient. However, I understand that there are certain circumstances where people are suffering, where they are going to die anyways, and that will save them a lot of pain. And in those circumstances, I think is even merciful.
Okay, so how do you make sure that the system isn't abused and the people that are suffering, not mentally ill specifically, but the people who are eligible right now, how do you make sure that they don't abuse the system and, potentially their suffering might not be suffering that's qualitatively true suffering. It might be suffering to them, but the suffering they experience, according to a doctor, might not be that requires assisted death. Tonya, I'm going to start with you.
I don't think it should be in the government's, or I was going to say, I reject any argument based off of religious understandings primarily, and that goes for this as well, but I don't think any doctor should have a say on how an individual actually feels. They might understand it from a scientific standpoint and medical standpoint, but they will never actually know how that person feels. So it should be in the right of that individual.
I think that actually we should take the doctor's point of view. Why? Because certainly you feel a lot of pain. But in the end of the day, the doctor might know if you can have a possible solution or no. Like in many cases, when this is conducted, it's because even the doctor agrees, like, you know what? This person is suffering a lot indeed. There's no, like the prospects of surviving are very low. So you know what? Better to go with assisted dying.
Okay, so this obviously right away brings us to the mentally ill because, clearly our panel all agrees that assisted dying is valid, it should be allowed, but the question is who should be entitled to it. So before we get to our panel's thoughts, we actually asked our audience on Instagram, do you support those with solely mental illness being eligible for assisted dying? And Christina, what were the results?
So we had 38% of the votes saying yes and 62% of the votes saying no. So the majority disagrees.
Now, you actually conducted your own poll, which was very interesting. And what was that? Well,
I decided to go to a different community where you can be anonymous and not judged, at least not, you're not really judged as much. So I went to Reddit and I asked Reddit, let me see. Oh, I have my results. So I asked them the same question that we did on our poll, and I actually got opposite results. So I had 60% of the votes say yes, they think that it should be allowed, and 40% said no.
Wow. So clearly very differing results.
Yeah.
What's interesting to note, though, is when I was watching the votes come in on the Instagram poll, when it was only 15 people that voted, it was neck and neck. It was like a one-person difference. But now let's go to you guys. Christina, what is your thoughts? Do you support those with solely mental illness being eligible for assisted dying?
Yeah, but I don't mean to say that as in anybody can. I suffer from mental illness, and I don't think that I should be allowed to go and apply for assisted suicide. I am not in a position where I need to or should. I'm medicated. I have resources for, managing my mental illness, and I don't think that I'm somebody who's eligible for it. Somebody who is mentally ill and death is imminent, like it's going to happen because they're so, they're going to do it on their own terms. I think we can maybe save some of that pain of somebody taking their own life in their own hands through assisted suicide. Not that assisted suicide is ever good or great or, it's all very sad. But I do think that there are a lot of mental illnesses that no matter what are going to result in death.
Anna, how do you respond? First of all, do you agree that people with mental illness should be eligible?
No, that's where I reserve my I don't agree with that. And I actually think that the most vulnerable people can feel indeed pressure into going to this because they think that they might be a burden to their family, that no one is going to take care of them. And, if you have someone that is like chronically depressed, there should be options for him or for her, and providing assisted suicide is like, I'm suicidal, take the knife and kill yourself, basically. Only that we're going to do it nicely. And that's basically not solving the root cause. And well, I have other opinions, but we will discuss that as the show continues.
Okay, Tonya, your take?
I do support it, but only based on the principle that a person's life is their own to end if they want to or not. And it's really hard to fashion an argument against that against like death with dignity under that understanding, I feel. Mm-hmm. And also, I only I only support someone wanting assisted suicide or seeking that after they've tried many options, extensive years trying, psychotherapy or psychiatry, whatever it is, only as a sort of like last resort, which sounds negative, but that's really
is a last resort.
That's just how I would ideally like to see the policies go.
Yeah, to add to my answer, I feel the exact same way. I don't think it should be the first choice. Yeah. I don't think it's that shouldn't be the first option. There should be many trials of medication, treatment, and assisted suicide being the last resort, the same way that you would treat a physical illness that way.
I think it's really important that I know this comes into effect, I think 2 years from now.
The mental illness portion, yes.
But I really do think legislation needs to be very critical and put in certain markers to make sure it doesn't go overboard.
Well, they are setting up that committee. The government is setting up that committee, but you both bring on two important questions, which is number one, how do you decide which mental illness is eligible? And number two, how do you decide what is extensive suffering? Like, to someone who went to one doctor, they might say, well, that's it for me, I've done enough. To someone else, they might have gone to 10 or 20. So how do you make that judgment, and how do you decide which mental illness is eligible?
That's exactly what is problematic right now, because there are different psychiatric associations, and not only in Canada, actually abroad, this is a topic that has been discussed deeply. And the thing is that the legislation, if I'm not wrong, it says that it's irremediable, so it needs to be some illness that there's no way to help. But the problem with mental illness is that there is not like an agreement between different psychiatric what can be an irremediable situation. Mm-hmm. So that's the lagoon that you can find in this kind of legislation.
I actually wanted to bring up my mom's profession because it fits perfectly in this, but she's a psychotherapist, and which means, for anyone who doesn't know, psychiatry is when you go to a therapist and they prescribe medication to you. But psychotherapy is more based on verbal talk therapy. There's a lot of different other components to it as well, but she's been doing this for years now, and she has that mindset where I think most mental health workers would have this, where they just don't see death. They don't want that to ever be an option. And I was speaking to her recently, and she mentioned a good point that she thinks that if someone really wanted to end their lives, like, they would have already. And so she just thinks there's like always an option. So. Do I agree with that? Not necessarily. Again, because I'm very like human rights, it's your own body, but I understand that from a mental health worker's perspective.
I think there's also, though, just from obviously my own circumstances are not the same. Like my mental illness is, I am not suicidal. I manage very well, but I'm within my immediate family, or not immediate family, but within my very, very close family. I've got a few mentally ill family members that have been at points where they're suicidal and where that's a real possibility. And a lot of the time, the reason that they don't do it is because of, I mean, you can get to a point where it doesn't matter, nothing else in the world matters. But to some extent, if you still have some love for your friends and your family, I think that's another factor, right? People maybe will not take their lives despite the fact that they desperately want to or even need to, because they don't want to leave that burden with their family. You know, there's a lot of people who believe that suicide is selfish. That's a real thing. People thinking that, how could they do this to me? How could they leave and then we have to pick up all the pieces? I think that's something that does weigh on somebody who's mentally ill and could be a reason why they haven't done it already, you know?
I think some people even stop because they have a dog. And like I have read cases like that.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to maybe acknowledge, though, that someone may be severely mentally ill or depressed because their lack of a family, like they might not have one to begin with, and that's the cause of their mental illness. So at least I know that's
And with depression, though, I mean, is depression curable? Who knows? In some people it's curable, in some it's not. And
I just to because I think I've said this before, that most or many mental illnesses are not curable, they're manageable. And it depends on the circumstances. People who have, let's say, seasonal depression, so they only have it, because I know people who you can be medicated for it, but it's seasonal depression, so you're only depressed for certain seasons of the year, usually winter, or the colder months. And that's something that I imagine is treatable, because it's not a permanent, it's not sticking with them forever. People can, PTSD is not always a lifelong.
I think even normal depression just comes in waves.
Yeah,
like,
and PTSD is something that goes away with time and treatment. However, if you're depressed or anxious due to a chemical imbalance, medication can help, but that's an actual wiring of your brain that causes you to feel that way, and you basically can never get away with it or away from it. Because I'm at my age now, 23, eventually end of the year I'll be 24. I've lived as long as I've been a conscious being and had my own thoughts. I have suffered from anxiety my entire life. My parents knew that there was something a little bit off with me because I would obsess over things, whatever. So I've lived a lifetime with this, and I know that I'm going to live a lifetime with this. It's not treatable. It's manageable.
Well, the same can be said for physical illnesses. A lot of them are manageable, but they're not curable. So how do you justify, not you particular, but in general, how do you justify mental versus physical, and which one is worthy of, unfortunately, making that final decision?
Because if you have let's say you have your whole life, you're going to have a bad leg or a bad back. Well, I mean, that can also cause depression. So that's another conversation. But let's say you live a whole life with, you're always going to have a bad shoulder because of some sort of injury playing sports. That is not equivalent to suffering from mental illness. It's just not. Mental illness.
I don't know if you could say that.
I can't say that, like, if I pulled my shoulder out when I was doing sports and then forever I'm going to have a little bit of a funny shoulder. That's not a reason to die.
I just feel like mental illness, it's so personal either way, if it's physical or mental, but mental illness can be so severe that it can almost like feel like a physical pain to somebody, right?
That's what I'm saying, though, is I'm saying that there's, when I'm talking about, I'm saying that mental illness can can be much more detrimental to somebody's health than just having a bad shoulder for the rest of their life.
but
That's the comparison that I'm making. If you're schizophrenic and you're suffering every day of your life, and then somebody has a bad shoulder and they're suffering every day of their life, of course it's different for each person, but one person is suffering more severely.
But first of all, how do you justify who's suffering more severely? And second of all, there are people with mental illness who don't know they're suffering, like people with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Right. And well, this
even
is,
with autism, like they.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we want to. I don't know if we want to classify if we want to pair autism with like mental illness.
Well, no, it's. I mean, it's not a mental illness, but rather it's a
brain
disorder.
condition.
It's a disorder. And my point was just that like people with autism can live very meaningful, productive lives, right? Yeah.
But the difference that I'm trying to make is that like with a physical illness, sometimes one is worse than the other. You know, if you've been diagnosed with cancer and you're stage 1, you're not suffering as badly as somebody with stage 4, because that's a scientific fact. You're not, you know, like if you're going through chemotherapy and you're approaching death, you are suffering more than an individual who's just been diagnosed and they're in the very, very, very early stages.
The argument that I find here interesting is this is something that I was actually talking. This topic, I had a conversation with one of my friends that she's studying psychology. And something that she said is most of mental illnesses, even schizophrenia, they are manageable. People can go with psychotic breakdowns. And that's a very important point that we need to take into consideration, because once you go into assisted dying, like there's no way back. You can come back from a psychotic breakdown. You cannot come back from death. And another thing that she mentioned, and it was very important because it makes me think about it, how can we make sure that this person is taking a rational decision when he or she is suffering from a mental illness? How can we ensure that this person is taking this decision of dying fully rational and from a logic point of view?
And that's exactly what was coming up next. How do you prevent families from preemptively ending the lives of those with mental illness?
Well, I think that this is now the conversation about, you should never jump into this kind of a decision. You should never, just because you're, having a bad day, you make the decision that's it. We are able to, doctors can evaluate patients, and they know for the most part whether or not they're going through a psychotic break. There are clear signs, and I've talked about it before, and I have seen these psychotic breaks with my family members, and it is clear that that in that moment they are not in a position to be making that kind of decision. And I agree that while somebody's having a break, or they're clearly not in their right mind, they should not be able to make that decision, because it could be a regrettable decision, right? You can't come back from death. And just a side note, I was watching this documentary about people who committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge, and the documentary is about them regretting the decision. So they survived, and they're interviewed after, or whatever, years later, and they said while they were jumping, they regretted jumping.
The second they left the edge, they regretted it.
So I think there has to be some serious precautions taken. I don't think it should be easy. I don't think it should be taken lightly.
Because once you don't have a life, like you don't even have a human right anymore.
Yeah, so I absolutely do not think that it's something that should be jumped into. I think like we were like Tonya and I were talking about early, like at the beginning of the episode, is that there needs to be evidence of years of treatment and attempts to get better, and there needs to be proof that it's not going to get better.
Yeah.
Well, Tonya, I mean, since your mom is a psychotherapist, has she dealt with people who have said that they feel like assisted dying is the solution?
Whether it's normal suicide, everything she's dealt with, And again, like she's managed to herself successfully treat these patients without pharmaceuticals, and she's had basically no one that's actually,
gone through
yeah,
with it?
yeah, like she's helped every single one of her patients. So,
And do you talk about these things with her sometimes?
Yeah, just out of interest, actually. So.
And what's your take on that?
I really love what she does because I don't personally. I think I brought this up on last time on the show, but I don't like pharmaceutical medications. I think that they're necessary for some people in certain circumstances. But if you can avoid taking a pharmaceutical medication and instead go for like a natural, more therapeutic route that way, then just do that. But I think if you can talk something out, that works, then that's better than taking a med for the rest of your life.
Well, some people, you bring up a good point about medication.
Yeah.
You know, some people that either have a physical problem or a mental issue might not want to take medication and think that death is the
Lots
only
of people
answer.
don't, and I think that's increasing. More and more people aren't comfortable with that.
Why?
Well, there's side effects. Whether it's the willingness, like it takes a while to find the right type of medication too, and a lot of people aren't willing to do that. So, because there's so much out there, really.
So, do you think that these people should be given the go ahead to request and receive assisted death?
I still say yes, because it's not my life, and that's how I see it. I said at the beginning of the show that's my that principle, but I wouldn't condone it at all.
I think that Tonya and I were both libertarians, but we're both libertarians in a different sense.
Yeah.
She supports basically what is called liberty all the way, and I support something that is called like liberty for the good. But it's a very interesting thing because there's an essay that was wrote, I think, with information about Saint Thomas Aquinas, and he said about liberty for the good. I support liberty for the good, and I think that as humans we should treat what is good for ourselves and for our fellow human beings. And the reality is that meds are horrible in a certain ways. I have been under medication myself. I was taught that I couldn't even go to work, and I still wanted to go to work when I was under medication, and I felt like part of my brain was numb for a lot of time. And but the thing is that I'm still thankful. I'm still thankful because that helped me to heal. During my psychotic episode, the last thing that I would wanted for myself was that I was going to be suicidal, which in a certain point I was, unfortunately. And having someone telling me, okay, well, take it, bye.
You bring up
This is the end.
something because you say that like you were suicidal, and like I'm sorry, that's very unfortunate, but like I also was. I was a teenager and I haven't had those feelings for like quite some time, but I almost think that this is very normal. Like it seems like everybody has some form of a mental illness to some degree, which makes me think that it's not actually as severe or negative as we like the stigma.
That's what a lot of people were discussing. Yeah. Like the thing with mental illness particularly is that it's incredibly common.
Yeah.
And that's why the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights actually raised an alert when Canada passed this legislation, because they thought like, what if you impact the vulnerable? What if you're killing people that can actually, have a life?
Now, on that note of more people having mental illness, do you think that this is a generational issue, or do you think people have always had mental illness to some degree, but they just never talked about it?
I think the second.
Yeah,
I
the
think
second.
the second. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's a lot to do with social media.
Social media though,
is modern.
Is modern.
Well, I think it's just increased.
You think it's just more talked about?
It's more talked about, but it's also sort of heightened. I feel like these fundamental ideals, I'm not going to get into it, but like masculinity, femininity, all that stuff. So it's just made everything kind of worse. Like,
Christina?
I was going to say, I think it's both. And I'm sure Anna knows from being from Venezuela, the cultural difference of mental illness not being talked about, especially in certain communities. In Black and Latino communities, it is not, and I mean, there's more communities, but these are predominant groups of people where it is not talked about. You can't be mentally ill. The only way to describe somebody who's mentally ill is that they're crazy or that they're psychotic.
Yeah, that's the problem at hand.
And
stigma.
we live in a country where there are a lot of there's a lot of people suffering in silence because we have a very multicultural society.
And I wanted to add something, and is that as a personal story, when like my current employer, they actually give you like money to go to therapy.
That's amazing.
In my last employer, I actually had to go to therapy in basically hiding and lying because if they found out, like I could be like my reputation was going to be so damaged. And that was in Venezuela. So that's how society deals with that.
Oh my gosh. I was going to mention just my favorite, Jordan Peterson. He has the line, life is suffering. And I don't think life should fully be suffering, but it's important to understand that life involves suffering and that we wouldn't know what happiness is without it, or stability even. But if someone is persistently living in a state that is unfulfilling or not prosperous in any way, like
a low quality of life.
Yeah, just like I feel like that's not my say to dictate whether they want to continue to live or not.
Well, what's interesting is I read a study a while back that in the 50s, people that were in mental asylums had the same amount of stress or anxiety that today's college students have. So what does that say about... Now, again, you can fact check me. That's something that I read. Hopefully it's true. I mean, not hopefully, but I'm just hoping that I'm telling the truth. But what do you guys think about that? If that is true, the stress levels and...
Of course. And university is it's only gotten worse since if your parents went to school. My parents went to school, and the cases of mental illness in their universities, they went to, some of those bigger schools. My dad went to Guelph. My mom went to Western. And this prominence of mental illness wasn't the as extreme as it is today. And I think that there's a bunch of factors, societal factors. I think school has gotten harder. I think pressure has gotten worse. I think the pressure to be educated is higher than it ever was, because now we are a society of overqualified people who can't get jobs. So it's people reaching and reaching and reaching for more education, and it's driving people to becoming anxious and depressed and overwhelmed.
That's what I was wanting to add, that even like when a school can be difficult, I think it's the pressure that what about if I finish school and I don't get a nice job? Like, it's so competitive, the environment.
Like Waterloo has like an extremely high suicide rate of students.
So does U of T.
Yeah, and U of T.
Yeah.
There was, I know what, I went to McMaster. There was a case of a medical student who ended up taking his life. I know that this and so U of T and Waterloo have these high cases of suicide. So this isn't just people suffering from mental illness or being overwhelmed. This is like a huge portion of young people who are taking their lives. That's way beyond overwhelming, like being overwhelmed.
That goes to a larger discussion of the pressures of general society, right? But in terms of more people, like you said, having these mental illnesses, are these the kinds of people that are going to take advantage of or utilize the assisted dying bill?
Well, they shouldn't be, and that's why I hope that there's, regulations on that, like I said earlier. But
Anna?
I don't know. Like, we would need to wait how this evolve, because right now it's very new. They are giving 24 months. They are expecting that, the pandemic situation will go down, because a lot of people are suffering also from depression due to COVID. But there's not even warranty, because let's be honest, 2 years from now we're going to be suffering probably from the economic effects and from other effects that might carry on, and people are going to be probably more depressed than now. You never know.
Well, you mentioned that the bill, you reiterated that the bill is not, this portion of the bill is not going to come into effect for another 2 years. So this brings the question of, and this particular point was rejected by the Senate and rejected, this amendment was rejected, which is people having the right to request assisted dying before they become mentally incapable. So people would have had the right to say, if someone has Alzheimer's and they start to lose their minds, or they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's, right? And they ask for assisted death, before they become mentally incapacitated. This was rejected by the Senate. Do you think it shouldn't have been? Do you think it should be included in the bill?
Yeah, I think that's okay.
I have, so there was just one, when I was doing some more research into this topic, one thing that, this is just a quote from a Global News article. It says, a strong majority of senators argued that the exclusion of mental illness in assisted suicide was unconstitutional, violating the right to equal treatment under the law, regardless of physical or mental disability, as guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Yeah.
That's my answer.
Well, that doesn't exactly answer the question, which is, do you believe that people should be able to request assisted death before they become mentally incapable of doing it?
Oh, okay. Well,
because that was rejected by the Senate.
Right. So I think that becomes difficult because I think we're more so looking at patients who are likely to develop dementia or Alzheimer's, right?
But if they've been diagnosed with it,
and
they cannot go.
Right.
They are not allowed to request it before they lose it.
That's such a hard one because I don't want to say that, if you're in that state of mind, you're not in your clear mind and that's how you're living your life, but it feels wrong to tell them that they can't make that decision. But what if they make the decision one day and they forget they made it the next? You know what I mean? Like, that's something that could happen. Like, there's things.
But like you said, though, would that happen though? Because if they said one day they're ready for it, I don't think it would be a one-time check mark on the ballot process.
No, of course not. I think it would require a lot of. You'd have to really monitor this patient. It's when it gets to that point, it's hard. Mm-hmm. And I don't really know how I feel about it. I don't 100% disagree with allowing people to make that decision before it happens.
So it should have been included in the bill, you think?
I don't know. I think there needs to be more work around, and I need to see more studies and evidence that could be carried out, more like, it needs to be
more analyzed.
Yeah. Like I don't want to jump to a conclusion on it because I don't 100% know how that would look, but.
I agree with rejecting that motion, and it is because I don't know, maybe it's because the cases of people with Alzheimer's that I have seen are people that sure they have been impacted badly, their families have been impacted badly, but they have been taken care of, they have been surrounded by so much love, and like none of their relatives would have regretted taking care of them, and all of them
But you don't know that. You don't know that. There are a lot of people who unfortunately neglect people with Alzheimer's dementia.
Then we need to promote more love in society, more empathy. Yeah. That's what I agree. The values, the right values.
Just emphasize mental health and therapy.
Yeah, because honestly, it's sad if we're taking that as a reason. Like, it's sad that people can just treat other human beings like they were nothing.
It is sad. Unfortunately, it's a reality. But yeah.
There was just like one thing I wanted to share this episode because it was something that I was very invested in. It was Lawrence Hill, Canadian author. And I think we talked about this off screen, but so I'm sure people know him. He's got a bunch of famous books.
Do you want to mention one of his most?
The Book of Negroes is like his biggest hit. That was like a worldwide bestseller. He's from Hamilton. Shout out. I'm not from Hamilton, but I went to school there. So his mother flew to I don't remember the year, maybe 2016 or later, I can't remember, but his mother flew to Switzerland for assisted suicide because Canadian laws were too restrictive. So she it doesn't, from what I remember and what I know, is she didn't have any physical illness. But she had tried committing suicide 3 times in her life. She was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and suffered her entire life. So it was a lifetime of hospital visits, medication, therapy, and nothing was working. And she tried to kill herself 3 times. And the big thing that she advocated for her entire life was that she wanted to go out on her own terms. She nursed her husband. He was very, very sick, eventually passing away, and it didn't seem like a very nice death. It seemed like there was a lot of suffering. And so she kind of always advocated that I want to go out on my own terms, and she did just that.
Dying with dignity.
She wanted to die with dignity. She did not want to die suffering. She knew, like, this mental illness that she had lived with, that she had already tried 3 times, and she knew it was going to happen again. She wanted to die. Mm-hmm. And and he talks about it. There's an article in the Globe and Mail, and he talks about it, that it wasn't easy for her to make that decision. It was a lifetime of thinking, I want to go out on my own terms. I'm mentally ill and I'm suffering, and nothing I'm doing is helping. I'm in physical pain from how mentally ill I am, which is another thing. You can develop physical symptoms if your mental illness is severe. So she decided to do it on her own terms. And he said that she was beautiful and radiant, and it was sad, but she went out happy because that's how she wanted to go out.
And I mean, obviously, you can only want the best for someone who is suffering, and that takes us to the future because, as we've mentioned several times, this particular amendment does not come into effect for the next 2 years. So what do you think will happen in the next 2 years? Will people wait for the law to come in, or do you think there will be more suicides, unfortunately? Anna?
I cannot predict what is going to happen, if there's going to be more suicides. I think that either without assisted dying, people can just go and proceed to kill themselves, especially during seasonal depression. That happens. But the thing, like I said before, I wouldn't just give the person who is depressed the tools to already end with his life, because that will be basically just not finding the solution, is just actually giving into the illness.
Might be a solution to them, though.
Only because they're mentally ill. Then, like I said, with a sane mind, they wouldn't do that.
Tonya?
Well, I think it's important to mention, or just to really frame up, that the Supreme Court originally permitted assisted dying because extreme illnesses that cause pain and discomfort, and I think that includes mental illness, or it should include mental illness. And if someone is finding out that they have a disease or whatever, it's going to progress, and they don't want to experience that, rightfully so, then they should be allowed to die before that, or before the mental state changes, basically. So,
and I think that it's also important to note that mentally ill people are not insane and unable to make these decisions.
Exactly.
That's something that I think is really important, and needs to be considered in this conversation. Is mentally ill people can be very lucid and very aware of what's going on. When they're going through an episode of some sort, they're not necessarily thinking clearly, and that's, like I said, that's not a circumstance where they should be able to make that decision. But you can be mentally ill and very clear-headed, suffering, but aware of why you're suffering and what's happening. Like many people with schizophrenia understand that there's something very serious going on in their head, and they can to some extent disconnect and look at it and say, I am mentally ill. Like, these aren't people who can't make decisions. Mm-hmm. So I think it's unfair to label them as unstable and unable to make these decisions, because they do very often have periods in their life where they're lucid and aware of what's going on and aware of their circumstances. So that's another thing I think that needs to be considered when we have this conversation.
Do you think more people will be requesting assisted death when this comes into effect?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't see this now being like everybody who's suicidal or suffers from mental illness is going to request this. I think it's going to be severe cases, because people have bouts of suicidal ideations in their life. You might, I've been with my mental illness, I've had moments where I'm very depressed, and I've never, not recently at least, been suicidal, but I can understand getting to that point. But I think that when I'm in that state, when I'm very depressed, I'm not necessarily in my right mind to make that decision, but I can reflect on it now while I'm in my clear mind and say that I shouldn't be allowed to request assisted suicide, I all I'm trying to say is I think it needs to be a severe case, as it does with physical illness. We don't just let anybody who's suffering physically request assisted suicide. There needs to be serious circumstances. I don't think we're going to see more people requesting it. I think it's a really big decision, and people are aware of how serious the decision is, even when it's related to physical illness. So I don't see there being an influx in people requesting it for mental illness.
I'm pretty sure, I think the Netherlands has it legalized already, or has, and we don't see like a country like that. There's no extreme death rate. People aren't killing themselves. Like, it's not crazy
Most
like
of the
that.
people requesting actually assisted death in the Netherlands are because of depression.
Yeah, well, I'm saying it's not expedited or gone out of control.
No, they don't have a problem there of it's not like it's gotten out of control.
Yeah.
Like, but if it's always been available, then obviously it wouldn't seem like it's out of control.
I don't think it's always.
It hasn't always been.
No,
how long has it been in
I don't know how
not
long,
for that
but
long.
No.
Anywhere where it is legal, it has not existed for very long, because when you think about how often our concepts of mental illness are changing, it's not something that is very that's existed for very long anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Anna?
I think that first of all, we need to they need to find a way to define what could be an irremediable illness. That's the main point. And secondly, for me, assisted death in general is something that is completely just reserved in very, very strict cases where the person is literally suffering. And as a matter of fact, and as a personal story, my granddad, he was basically put to die because he was suffering so much and there was no way to help him, that low-key the doctor, because Venezuela is illegal, but lawless country too, and they decided to let's save him some pain, because he was actually requesting to die. He couldn't even breathe at that point. So there wasn't any solution.
And I think when you get to it's also a bit of an easier decision for elderly people who are already at the end of their life and they're in pain, suffering from whatever illness they might be.
Even their sons were like, I don't want to see him that way.
Well, how do you?
No, that's what I'm saying is I was in the same position with my grandfather. He wasn't euthanized, but he got to a point where he had said, if I'm dying, do not resuscitate. If I'm having a heart attack, whatever it might be, do not save me. Let me die. And that was a request, and the doctors were aware that if he went into cardiac arrest or whatever, he was not to be saved.
But a DNR is very different from requesting assisted death.
No, of course. But what I'm saying is that I think there's also, when you look at the elderly, there's also another. There's so much to talk about.
Also, they felt like in the case of my granddad, he felt like he lived his life. Like, he already lived his life. He already had an illness that consumed him. He suffered from diabetes, and he lost even limbs of his body. So it was a completely tragedy. So he felt like, this is my end. Just let me go.
I mean, one thing I wanted to bring up before we go is Samuel Sedegat, who used to be a panelist on the show. He said there's a reason the government doesn't allow people with mental illness to own guns. How does this relate?
I just thought of something I just thought of a statistic, but I don't know if it's primarily in the States or all over the world, but people who attempt to kill themselves with a gun in the mouth, and most of the time, basically, they're aiming for the brain, but it hits like the throat, and you end up with permanent throat damage instead of actually doing what you supposedly wanted to do. So, yeah,
I don't see there's a reason you don't give somebody who's mentally ill.
But that's another reason why there should be safe.
That's exactly. Yeah. That's what I mean, and that's exactly how I feel. Is we don't want to for them to be taking these matters into their own hands, because there's people who decide to go out through murder suicide. Yeah, they take their life and their partner's life, or their life and their children's lives. What if they're given an option where you've been suffering your entire life with this thing? Don't do it with a gun. Do it in a more humane way that hurts
Just a less
people.
gruesome.
Yeah.
I think that is because of the same reason that I don't agree with assisted death for mentally ill people, because they know that these kind of decisions, they don't trust the decision of people who can go through mentally like psychotic episodes.
And that's what Samuel
So
says.
if it is a mental, and that's once again brings me to the question, how can we assess that they are not saying this just because of the illness?
What I'm and just to counteract is that that's why it has to be a long process to get to that point. It cannot be made off, you can't just make that decision. There has to be a very long process behind it. And you need to analyze this person, and you cannot allow somebody who's going through a psychotic episode to make that decision.
Yeah, unfortunately, there is a large part of society is mentally ill, whether that's extreme or not. I talked about that earlier, but we can't ignore that, basically. So it's, do we deal with it accordingly, or do we just let them something's got to be.
There's a lot of nuance to the subject, and it's obviously very, very tricky in deciding how to assess it, right? But
there is a lot of moral questions. Like it's an entire moral case about it.
Yeah, and that's part of the discussion, right? But you all agreed that assisted death is morally all right to end people's suffering, and it just came down to whether the mentally ill fall into that category. But that was our show for this week. Thank you to everyone that tuned in and that messaged us live. Tonya, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
We love having you.
Thank you again, guys, for having me back. It was great.
You have to come back one more time, maybe
just one more time. Okay.
Just so we can get her up to second place for most guest appearances.
Okay, I see. Yeah. For those who don't know, Christina, before she became a panelist on the show, had the most guest appearances on the show. But look at you now, main panelist.
Yeah.
2 seasons.
Yeah, it's my show.
Your show.
Mine,
okay.
yeah.
Well.
Anna, how you feeling?
No, my show and Anna's show.
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
She's
not
supposed
just
to be the leftist. Like, no, this is sharing, darling.
No. It's we share here. It's my, when I say it's my show, that also means it's Anna's show. We share.
I love how this is the point that you both became the loudest and just blew the audio out, but that's fine.
I know, I talking to myself.
Sorry.
This is why audio checks at the beginning of the show are very important, but clearly they don't matter. So once again, thank you to everyone that tuned in. Christina and Anna, it has been a pleasure as always. Has it been a pleasure for you guys, I hope?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming on.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah.
A brand new episode of the Raben Report will be coming to you next week, same day, same time, almost the same people. Have a good night, everyone.